On January 7, 1942, deep within his fortified headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler delivered a monologue to his innermost circle that would profoundly shape the disastrous course of German strategy in the Second World War. With the supreme confidence of a dictator at the height of his power, he offered a verdict on the United States of America. In Hitler's view, America did not represent the future. It was a decayed, mongrel nation tethered to the past. He saw a country hopelessly fractured by social inequalities and, most importantly to his worldview, paralyzed by racial chaos. He explicitly described American society as being half Judaized and half negrified, rhetorically asking his sycophant generals how a state composed of such disparate, inferior elements could possibly hold together under pressure. To the Führer, America was a loud, brash, commercial entity, incapable of the martial discipline and national unity required for total war. At almost that exact moment, some 7,000 miles away in a modest shipyard office in Richmond, California, a 57-year-old industrialist named Henry Kaiser was engaged in a very different kind of planning. Kaiser was a man who sketched ideas on hotel notepaper and ignored conventional wisdom. He was not a shipbuilder by trade. His background was in massive construction projects like dams, roads, and bridges. Yet, he was now tasked with constructing cargo vessels to keep Britain supplied. The established titans of the shipbuilding industry, men who had spent lifetimes mastering their craft, insisted that constructing a single cargo vessel was an 8-month process, requiring highly specialized artisans. Kaiser, looking at his rough sketches, told his newly assembled team that they would eventually build them in 4 days. Hitler believed the Americans were culturally and racially soft, destined to crumble. Henry Kaiser was about to spearhead an industrial revolution that would prove the German dictator catastrophically wrong. This profound German misjudgment didn't start with Pearl Harbor. It had been fermenting for years. Throughout the 1930s, German military intelligence had meticulously compiled reports on American industrial capacity, military readiness, and national character. The conclusions reached by these intelligence officers were remarkably consistent and, in hindsight, fatally flawed. They painted a picture of America as a nation obsessed with business and consumerism, populated by salesmen, not warriors. The hard data seemed to support this view. In 1939, the United States Army ranked among the smallest in the world, smaller even than Portugal's forces. American factories were masters of mass production, but they churned out civilian automobiles and kitchen refrigerators, not tanks and combat aircraft. The German assessment concluded that the American people had grown soft during the long peace following World War I and possessed no appetite for the terrible sacrifices demanded by modern conflict. Hitler's key advisors reinforced these prejudices, telling him that American claims regarding potential war production were mere propaganda designed to frighten Germany. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 a breathtaking goal of producing 50,000 aircraft per year, the German High Command dismissed it as a complete fantasy, a political number with no basis in industrial reality. At the time, total American military aircraft production had been fewer than 3,000 planes a year. The idea that this output could be increased by a factor of nearly 20 seemed industrially absurd to the German mind. Hermann Göring, the swaggering head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, shared his leader's deep contempt for American capabilities. Göring, a World War I ace, had built the German Air Force from a forbidden shell into the most feared military aviation force in Europe. He understood implicitly what was required to produce modern combat aircraft: precision engineering, specialized alloys, a highly trained workforce, and years of accumulated experience to refine production methods. America, in his view, possessed none of these advantages. The notion that Yankee automakers could suddenly conjure a world-class air force out of car factories struck him as genuinely laughable. Furthermore, the German generals felt they had a historical basis for their disdain. They had fought Americans before during the final year of the First World War, while American troops had arrived in France in vast numbers and performed adequately in 1918. German officers noted they had entered the conflict very late, suffered relatively light casualties compared to the exhausted European powers, and contributed little to the strategic direction of the war. The lingering memory of those raw green doughboys reinforced a deep-seated belief among the Prussian officer class that Americans lacked the necessary hardness and professional edge required for sustained, grueling combat against a first-rate enemy. Albert Speer, who would later become Hitler's armaments minister and the architect of Germany's own war economy, was present for many of these dinner conversations. He later recalled Hitler's steadfast belief that the Americans had not played a prominent role in the Great War and had made no great blood sacrifices. Therefore, Hitler reasoned, they would certainly not withstand a true trial by fire, for their inherent fighting qualities were low. Central to this entire analysis was Hitler's obsessive racial ideology. He argued that no such thing as a unified American people actually existed. In his eyes, the United States was nothing but a chaotic mass of immigrants from too many nations and too many races, lacking a cohesive racial core. This racial analysis was bedrock to Hitler's worldview. He fervently believed that national strength flowed directly from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its supposedly superior Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent strength that would inevitably manifest on the battlefield. America, viewed as a mongrel nation corrupted by the influence of Jews and African Americans, could not possibly match the martial spirit and unified will of the German Volk. However, this entire German analytical framework contained a fatal, foundational flaw. They were measuring American potential solely by American performance in peacetime. They surveyed a nation that had not yet mobilized for total war, and concluded, wrongly, that it was incapable of mobilizing. They looked at vast factories turning out shiny consumer goods, and assumed those same factories could not be repurposed to make weapons of war. They looked at a diverse, sometimes fractious population, and believed that diversity automatically equated to national weakness. In every one of these assumptions, they were wrong. The great American industrial transformation began even before the United States officially entered the war. In the desperate summer of 1940, with France having fallen to the Blitzkrieg and Britain standing alone under siege, President Roosevelt challenged American industry to perform what he termed a miracle of production. This was not merely a call to increase output. It was a directive for a fundamental restructuring of the entire American economy. The mandate was clear. Automobile factories would stop making cars. Appliance plants would stop making refrigerators. Every lathe, every hydraulic press, every assembly line in America was to be converted to war production. The scale of this pivot was staggering. In 1941, American assembly lines rolled off more than 3 million civilian automobiles. Over the next 4 years of war, that same mighty industry would build only 139 additional cars. The entire massive capacity of Detroit was redirected solely toward weapons production. Chrysler began manufacturing aircraft fuselages. General Motors turned its immense resources to producing airplane engines, machine guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard, known for luxury cars, began building legendary Merlin engines for the British Royal Air Force. Companies that had never manufactured anything more dangerous than a toaster or a vacuum cleaner learned almost overnight how to produce precision ammunition components. This conversion happened with a speed that stunned observers because American industry already possessed capabilities the Germans never truly understood or appreciated. The key was the American mastery of standardization and interchangeable parts. For decades, American factories had pioneered mass production techniques that allowed different facilities across the continent to manufacture components that fit together perfectly without hand-fitting. A carburetor manufactured in Ohio would fit flawlessly onto an engine block cast in Michigan, which would then power a vehicle assembled in California. This system, developed for efficient civilian production, was now applied with ruthless efficiency to the weapons of war. The skeptics, both domestic and foreign, insisted it couldn't be done. They argued that high-performance aircraft were not automobiles. You could not simply stamp out a heavy bomber. The way you stamped out a Ford Model T, the engineering tolerances required for aircraft were too precise, the hydraulic and electrical systems too complex. A single heavy bomber contained over 1 million individual parts, whereas a typical automobile had perhaps 15,000. Yet industrialists like Henry Kaiser ignored the skeptics. In December 1940, Kaiser won a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British. At that moment, he possessed no shipyard, no shipbuilding experience, and no workforce trained in maritime construction. What Kaiser did have was a system. For Kaiser, the specific product, whether it was a concrete dam, a paved highway, or a cargo ship, was less important than the process used to create it. He viewed shipbuilding not as a traditional craft, but as a large-scale manufacturing problem. He believed every manufacturing process could be analyzed, broken down into its smallest components, optimized for efficiency, and then scaled up massively. Traditional shipbuilders had always accumulated knowledge through long apprenticeships. A skilled riveter might spend years learning the nuance of his trade. Kaiser realized he didn't have years to train a workforce. He had months, perhaps only weeks. Therefore, he designed processes that could be learned by completely inexperienced workers in days. He ruthlessly substituted capital for labor wherever possible, investing heavily in massive cranes and machinery that could do heavy lifting previously done by hand. The established shipbuilding industry predicted failure. They argued that ships were too complex, and the ocean too unforgiving for vessels built by amateurs to survive. They would surely break apart and sink. Kaiser proved them wrong, not just on speed, but on quality. His ships were actually built better. The defect rate at Kaiser's yards was eventually less than half the defect rate found at conventional shipyards. The same systematic approach that accelerated production also standardized quality control. Kaiser applied the same principles that had allowed him to finish the Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He broke the shipbuilding process into modular components. Instead of constructing a ship from the keel up on a single slipway bottleneck in traditional yards, he prefabricated entire sections of the ship, such as bows or deckhouses, in different locations across the yard. Immense cranes then lifted these multi-ton sections into place, where they were assembled like giant building blocks. He also championed welding instead of traditional riveting. Welding was significantly faster, stronger, and, crucially, required far less training to master than the dark art of riveting. To man these enormous new yards, Kaiser recruited workers from across the entire country, sparking a massive internal migration. He built housing developments for them, established dozens of childcare centers for working mothers, and created a prepaid healthcare system to keep his workforce healthy and productive. The transformation of ordinary Americans into productive shipbuilders happened at a pace that defied all conventional wisdom. Men and women who had never seen the ocean, who had never held a welding torch, who had never set foot inside an industrial facility, learned to build ocean-going vessels in weeks. Kaiser's training programs were models of ruthless efficiency. A completely raw recruit could become a competent tack welder in 10 days. Within 30 days, they could be full, productive members of a shipbuilding team. The workforce came from every corner of American life. They were farmers from Oklahoma and Arkansas who had lost their land to the Dust Bowl drought. They were unemployed factory workers from Detroit who had been laid off during the Great Depression. Crucially, they included vast numbers of women who had never worked outside the home before. They also included tens of thousands of African Americans, seeking economic opportunities that were denied to them in the segregated South. The workforce at Kaiser's Richmond yards alone eventually peaked at over 90,000 people, and nearly a third of them were women. These women became the living symbols of American wartime mobilization. They drilled rivets, welded steel seams, installed complex wiring, and operated heavy machinery, performing work that had been exclusively the domain of men before the war. The government promoted their vital contributions through posters and films featuring strong, determined characters like Rosie the Riveter. These images became iconic representations of the homefront effort, proving that the workforce could expand in ways German planners, with their traditional views on gender roles, never anticipated. That the traditional shipbuilders watched this spectacle in disbelief. They had been building ships the same painfully slow way for decades and thought they knew the limits of the possible. Kaiser's methods violated every cherished principle of their craft. Yet, Kaiser's methods worked. In 1941, before Kaiser fully entered the scene, the average time to build a Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel of the war, was about 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced that time to 45 days, then 30 days, then 20. In a publicity stunt in November 1942 designed to show what was possible, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard built the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in an astonishing 4 days and 15 hours. From laying the keel to launching the completed, painted vessel took less time than a German U-boat needed to cross the Atlantic Ocean to hunt it. This industrial explosion created a strategic crisis the Germans had not anticipated. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the brilliant commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had staked his entire naval strategy on a cold, simple calculation of tonnage. He believed his submarines could sink Allied merchant shipping faster than the Allies could possibly replace it, thereby starving Britain into submission. In the early months of 1942, after America entered the war, this strategy appeared to be working brilliantly. German U-boats prowled the American East Coast during a period their crews called the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of merchant ships, often within sight of the shoreline. Oil tankers burned furiously off the coast of Florida, visible to tourists. Cargo vessels went down within view of New Jersey beaches. Reinhard Hardigan, the brazen commander of U-123, was among the first captains to hunt these virgin American waters. In January 1942, he torpedoed ships so close to shore that he could navigate by the glow of city lights reflected off the smoke of burning tankers. The Americans, complacent and unprepared, had not implemented blackout procedures and had not yet organized protective convoys. They seemed almost to be inviting attack. Hardigan sank 8 ships on his first patrol alone and returned to Germany a national hero. Other U-boat commanders followed his lead. Through the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. The losses were catastrophic to the Allied cause. Crucial oil that should have fueled tanks burned on the Atlantic beaches. Food meant for British civilians rotted on the seafloor. Strategic materials essential to the war effort vanished beneath the waves. Dönitz believed he was winning the tonnage war. His submarines were inflicting damage at a rate that exceeded even his most optimistic pre-war projections. If these losses continued, he calculated, Britain would be strangled, and the American war effort would collapse before it could fully mobilize its army in Europe. But even as the U-boats chalked up record kills, the American shipyards were accelerating their output. In 1942, American yards launched a total of 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, that number exploded to 19 million tons. By the autumn of 1943, new American construction exceeded total Allied losses for the first time in the war. The math had flipped. Every ship the U-boats painstakingly hunted down and sank was being replaced by 2 brand new ones. Dönitz watched these numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were sinking ships at a rate that would have easily won the First World War. But this was a different conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity defied all previous comprehension. The math became merciless. Dönitz calculated that his fleet needed to sink an average of 700,000 tons of shipping per month to strangle Britain. In 1942, they occasionally came close to that figure, but by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The target kept moving, always receding, always just beyond the reach of his exhausted crews. Worse for the Germans, the Americans were learning how to fight back. The early, humiliating disasters off the East Coast had exposed deep failures in anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Convoys were finally organized and rigorously protected. Long-range aircraft were deployed to patrol the shipping lanes, forcing U-boats to stay submerged and immobile. New technologies, like microwave radar, which could detect a surfaced submarine at night or through fog, and improved sonar gave the defenders advantages they had previously lacked. By May 1943, the situation had become untenable for the Germans. Dönitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic. In that single month, 43 submarines, a huge portion of his operational fleet, had been lost to Allied escorts and aircraft. The tonnage they sank no longer justified the horrific casualties they were suffering. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany absolutely needed to win to strangle Britain and prevent an American invasion of Europe, was lost. The U-boat crews who survived that Black May returned to their bases in occupied France in shock. They had gone to sea believing they were the hunters. They returned understanding they had become the prey. What happened on the high seas was replicated with even greater intensity in the air. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant outside Detroit became the ultimate cathedral of American industrial might. Designed by famed industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility covered 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world. Its sole purpose was to mass-produce the B-2 for Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber that was infinitely more complex than anything Ford had ever manufactured before. The challenges of adapting automotive mass production to aircraft were immense. The B-24 had over 1 million parts and required more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It demanded a level of precision engineering that the automobile industry had never before attempted. Ford's brilliant and abrasive production chief, Charles Sorensen, studied the methods of Consolidated Aircraft, the company that designed the B-24, and found them shockingly primitive. He saw bombers being assembled almost like artisanal crafts, sometimes outdoors, using techniques that hadn't changed significantly since the First World War. Sorensen proposed something revolutionary and, to many aviation experts, insane. He would build heavy bombers on a moving assembly line, exactly the way Ford built cars. Critics scoffed at the idea. Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, famously scoffed that you could not expect a blacksmith to make a fine watch overnight. The skepticism was not unreasonable. Aircraft manufacturing was fundamentally different from automobile production. A car could have minor manufacturing variations and still function perfectly well on the road. An aircraft with minor variations in its wing shape or control surfaces might fall out of the sky. The tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. The materials used were exotic aluminum alloys that behaved differently under stress than automotive steel. The aircraft's internal systems, hydraulics, high-voltage electrics, pressurized pneumatics, had to work in perfect harmony at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Ford struggled mightily initially. The government kept changing the aircraft's design based on combat reports, which constantly disrupted Sorensen's carefully planned assembly line flow. Workers, many of them former farmers or housewives, had to learn entirely new skills. The press mocked the giant facility, dubbing it Willet Run instead of Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman, heading a committee investigating war waste, toured the plant and publicly questioned whether Ford could ever deliver on its grandiose promises. The problems were very real. Every design modification required Ford to retool its expensive machinery. Metal stamping dies that had cost thousands of dollars became obsolete overnight. Ford's response to these setbacks was characteristically stubborn. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, converting Consolidated's often vague hand-drawn sketches into precise automotive-style manufacturing specifications. They produced an astonishing 5 miles of technical drawings every single day. When modifications made these drawings obsolete, before they could even reach the factory floor, Ford engineers simply started over without complaint. The company also pioneered decentralized production for aircraft. Instead of trying to build every single part of the bomber at Willow Run, Ford created a vast network of subcontractors. Engines came from Buick, propellers from Hamilton Standard, landing gear from Goodyear. The logistical challenge of coordinating the arrival of these millions of parts was itself an organizational miracle. By 1944, the teething problems were solved. Willow Run began living up to its promise, producing one complete B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. At peak production in April 1944, the plant turned out a staggering 453 heavy bombers in a single month. In one legendary feat of production, between April 24th and April 26th of that year, 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in a period of just 72 hours. The assembly lines ran relentlessly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even with this grueling schedule, efficiency improved so dramatically that the workforce was actually reduced from a peak of 42,000 down to 17,000. Even as production rates climbed, the Army Air Forces eventually had to ask Ford to slow down because they physically had no place left to park the aircraft. Storage areas at training bases were overflowing with brand new B-24s waiting for crews. Meanwhile, total American aircraft production reached numbers that the German High Command had once declared a mathematical impossibility. In 1944 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft. To put that in perspective, that single year's production exceeded Japan's total aircraft output for the entire war. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, accounting for roughly two-thirds of all Allied military equipment. The scale defied human comprehension. At its peak, American industry was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany possessed in its entire inventory at the start of the war. This torrent of machinery had devastating consequences in the skies over Europe. The Germans faced the consequences of their misjudgment directly in air combat. Luftwaffe pilots were among the best trained in the world, and their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, were formidable, technologically advanced machines. In one-on-one engagements, experienced German pilots often outperformed their inexperienced American counterparts. The early American bomber crews sent over Germany in 1943 suffered horrific casualties. Many pilots flying these dangerous missions had fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. Navigation errors frequently sent formations miles off course, breaking up their defensive boxes. Coordination with fighter escorts was often imperfect. German pilots exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly, developing tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and pick off stragglers, but the war of attrition was relentless, and the math was entirely on the American side. For every German aircraft shot down, the Americans could readily produce 3 more to take its place. For every experienced German pilot killed or wounded, the Americans were training 5 replacements in their massive flight schools back home. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative, crushing weight of an enemy that could absorb staggering losses and simply keep coming, day after day. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was sustaining catastrophic losses of roughly 25% of its aircrews and 40% of its fighter aircraft every single month. These were loss rates no air force in history could survive indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich did not possess a 1,000-year supply of pilots. German pilots who had begun the war with years of rigorous training were replaced by raw recruits who had only weeks of instruction. By the war's end, some terrified German pilots were flying their first combat missions with less than 100 hours of total flight time. The German misjudgment of America extended beyond industrial capacity to the fighting quality of American soldiers themselves. In February 1943, American ground forces met the German army in major combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result appeared to confirm every pre-war German prejudice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's battle-hardened Afrika Korps tore through the inexperienced American positions. American units, facing terrifying blitzkrieg tactics for the first time, broke and ran. Valuable equipment was abandoned in panic. Command and control completely collapsed. American casualties exceeded 6,000 men. Some German officers who had previously dismissed Americans as soft now felt they had concrete battlefield evidence to support their contempt. But Rommel, the Desert Fox, was too astute a general to let initial impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He watched what happened after the disaster at Kasserine, and what he saw troubled him deeply. The Americans recovered with startling, unexpected speed. Within weeks of the debacle, they had completely reorganized their forces, relieved incompetent commanders, and implemented brutal lessons learned in blood. General George Patton took command of the demoralized US II Corps and transformed it through sheer force of will. He demanded iron discipline, punished sloppiness, and drove his men to training standards they had never met before. Crucially, the American military possessed an institutional culture that encouraged learning from failure, something the rigid German system often lacked. After Kasserine, comprehensive reviews of what had gone wrong were conducted, and the findings were immediately sent back to training camps in the US to shape the preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. Rommel later noted that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock and recognized he was facing an opponent who would only get better with experience. But, furthermore, the Americans possessed a logistical advantage that stunned the Germans. German prisoners captured in Tunisia reported their sheer amazement at the abundance of American supplies. The American soldiers they fought seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, and unlimited high-quality food. When German units ran short of supplies, which happened constantly, they had to scavenge or improvise. When American units ran short, replacement supplies arrived in massive quantities within days. The lesson was clear to the intelligence officers analyzing the campaign. Material superiority could compensate for initial inexperience. As long as American factories kept running, American armies would keep fighting and improving. The ultimate consequence of Hitler's misjudgment was revealed on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944. The Allied invasion force was a behemoth of industrial power. The equipment that supported the assault, the thousands of landing craft, the transport aircraft, The specialized tanks that swam ashore came largely from American factories. The ships that bombarded German coastal positions were built in American yards. The aircraft that completely dominated the skies over the beachhead were produced on American assembly lines. The Germans fought with characteristic tenacity, but they were simply overwhelmed by the sheer volume of men and material brought to bear against them. The American doctrine explicitly prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk the lives of soldiers when you could expend tens of thousands of artillery shells to pulverize a position instead? By 1945, Germany was crushed. The nation Hitler had dismissed as racially inferior and industrially incapable had destroyed his armies. The evidence was undeniable across a ruined continent. The nation he had called decayed had outproduced Germany by a factor of nearly 3-1. The people he had called soft had fought with determination across 2 oceans. The industrial capacity he had mocked as mere propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht under an unstoppable avalanche of steel. The German High Command had believed what it wanted to believe about America, allowing racial ideology and arrogance to override objective analysis. That comforting delusion led directly to their catastrophic destruction.